Hi, I'm Peg Siciliano. I am a member of the board of the Traverse Area Historical Society and past archivist of the Society. We're here today to offer you a small taste of our very popular Oakwood Cemetery tour with a Halloween twist. Because of the COVID pandemic, we will not be offering these tours this year, but we certainly hope to see you next year. What I'm going to be offering today is just a very small portion of that to give you an idea of what the tour is like. If you like what you hear, please go to our website at www.traversehistory.org and find out more about our organization and how we preserve, protect, and present our local history. We are standing at the Traverse City State Hospital Monument. In this plot, there are 470 bodies of patients who were not claimed by their families when they passed away. The Traverse City State Hospital opened in 1885 and closed a little over 100 years later in 1989. When it first opened, it held 500 patients. At its peak, it could serve 3,000 patients at a time, and during the over 100 years that it was open, 50,000 patients passed through its doors. Originally, the hospital was called the Northern Michigan Asylum for the Insane. As psychiatric philosophies changed over the years, it received two other names. Most of the time, it was known as the Traverse City State Hospital, and then closer to the end of its existence, it was called the Traverse City Regional Psychiatric Hospital. The reason these bodies are here is because at the time that they passed away, the families had either moved away or they were not interested in claiming the bodies. The bodies were buried here between 1885 and 1916. After 1916, the bodies were donated for anatomical research to various universities. The Traverse City State Hospital holds a very interesting place in the history of Traverse City. When it opened under Dr. Munson, it was really ahead of its times in how it served its patients. Dr. Munson believed that in order to improve people's psychological health, you wanted to have them in a place of beauty and kindness. And while we may look back at those times now, and they seem somewhat horrific if we think in terms of electric shock treatments, or we think of how there were bars in the windows and all that kind of thing, we have to remember that at the time, up until the 1950s, 60s, they didn't have medications to treat people with psychological illnesses. So what they did, which that may seem harsh to us today, was actually an attempt to help these people at that time. And Dr. Munson and the hospitals of that time were actually in advance of what happened before the mid-1800s, when people that had these kinds of illnesses were actually usually sent to jail and just locked up. However, that sort of dual opinion or feelings that we have about the hospital leads to a lot of different kinds of stories floating around. Certainly, the hospital served thousands of patients well and gave them good treatment. On the other hand, especially at Halloween time here in Traverse City, a lot of people tend to think of the hospital as somewhat of a spooky place, and they dig up the old stories and legends and that type of thing that are attached to the hospital. It's interesting because the villages at the Commons now generally sort of try to downplay that, and we can understand that in terms of marketing to people to live there. There is, of course, a small chunk of people who would find that very interesting and perhaps want to live there in terms of the possible hauntings, but for most people it's probably not a really good marketing strategy. But today we are going to talk about two of those stories and whether there's any truth to them or whether they're just fun legends. So one of them is about the hippie tree, which is in the woods, on the hills, up above to the west of the hospital. And today it is painted with all different colors, and the legend that goes with it is that way back in the early 1900s, 2 boys from Traverse City disappeared. And the story goes that they went up in the woods behind there, and eventually they were found dead, and their bodies were, of course, brought back to their families. And then, based on that, what we now know, erroneous story, this whole idea opened up about the bodies were found next to this tree, and if you did the right kind of chants and danced around and stuff, you could open the gates to hell. Now, why anybody would want to do that is a little bit beyond me, but at Halloween time and other times of the year, sometimes people just like scaring themselves. We have done research in the newspapers from the years that those boys apparently or supposedly disappeared, and there were no disappearances. So this is a story that was made up sometime probably in the 1940s, 50s, or 60s, and has sort of held on down through the years. It's basically harmless as long as you don't attach it to the value of the psychiatric care that was given to the patients that went through the state hospital. One other story that people share, sort of multiple stories, are stories of doors slamming when there was no one there, people hearing screams in the windows, seeing lights going through the building. Yeah, some people believe in those things and believe that there truly were hauntings, and I'm not going to stand here and tell you that it couldn't be possible, but there tends to be the other side of the story that says, there's logical explanations of someone having a radio on, thinking it was screams, a watchman going through with a light, that kind of thing. So I think we can look at our state hospital grounds and the wonderful things that the Minervinis have done and see it as a place of beauty, and still use it as a little bit of a place where we can have a little fun and just realize that legends are legends. We are here in Oakwood Cemetery, right at the mausoleum of Julius T. Hanna, his wife Elsie Raff Hanna, and her family. Julius, you may recognize his last name Hanna, as he is the son of Perry Hanna, well known as the father of Traverse City. Most of us don't know as much about Julius, and there is a good reason for that. Julius was born in 1858 and died in 1905, just 1 year after his famous father passed away. Think about that. Think of celebrities today and how often, we hear stories of the difficulties that their offspring have, finding a place for themselves in the shadow of their famous parents. Well, think of Julius. He grew up in his father's shadow. Now, we have no reason to think that their relationship wasn't a fine relationship and that he wasn't sad when his father passed away. However, it would have given him a chance to move into the leadership of the company. He had started working in the company at the bottom rungs, worked his way up, as far as we can tell, was very successful, and then he passed away. While, as far as we know, Julius's relationship with his father for most of his life was a good one, we do have reason to believe that closer to the end of it, there were some problems. Elsie Raff lived right across the street to the east of the Perry Hanna mansion. And there are reasons to believe that the Hannas were not super thrilled with Julius marrying Elsie. Her father was quite successful in comparison to pretty much anyone else, other than perhaps Perry Hanna. And there are, again, stories somewhat substantiated that Elsie was not welcome in the Hanna house even after the marriage. Now, perhaps a proof of that, or something that would make us think that could be true, is the fact that the Perry Hanna family plot is on the southwest corner of Oakwood Cemetery. The mausoleum here of Julius is more on the, northeast corner. Not quite as far apart as it could possibly be, but close to it. So that does sort of lead to the possibility that there was some tension there towards the end of Perry Hanna's life. Speaking of houses and the fact that the Rath and the Hanna house were right across the street from each other, this does bring up another Halloween with a Twist story that we're offering in these videos that we're giving, whether you watch them at Halloween or not. And it brings up a house I had a personal experience with in the Boardman neighborhood. There's a relatively new cottage type house sitting on a corner in that neighborhood. I always thought it was very beautiful. When I first moved to town in the mid-1980s, it was an empty lot. At some point, this house was built. It was an aesthetic architecture that I really like, so I paid a lot of attention to it. And it seemed to be turning over. Every 2 or 3 years, there'd be a for sale sign, and someone else would buy it. And then 2 or 3 years later, it would be back up for sale again. Seemed odd to me because the location was gorgeous, the house was beautiful. And then when I was working as the archivist, one evening, a couple came in and they started asking me about information I might have on a house in Boardman neighborhood. And it turned out it was the same house that I had noticed over the years. As we talked further, they eventually got comfortable with me and they revealed that they were thinking of purchasing it because they had heard it was haunted. And they were the kind of couple that was actually something that was attractive to them. They wanted to move into a haunted house. So I started doing some research trying to figure out if there was any, substance to this. And I looked back through the newspapers and the records and I found out that what had sat on that lot before it was torn down was a grocery store. And it had apartments above it. Now, I didn't find anything about the grocery store being haunted. However, when I looked into the tenants of the apartments, for several years there was a man who lived up there, and his name was Fred Deadman. Deadman. No story of any hauntings or, untoward doings going on up there, but I must admit the name Deadman did catch my attention given the questions that were being asked. We are here at the marker of Dr. Augusta Rosenthal-Thompson. Her story is one of groundbreaking success, heartbreak, and ultimately heart-touching providence, or perhaps, if you wish to look at it this way, supernatural karma. Dr. Augusta Rosenthal was born in Indiana in 1859. She would become one of the first women to graduate from the University of Michigan School of Medicine and one of the first women in the United States or the world to become a doctor. In the late 1870s or early 1880s, she came to northern Michigan to Traverse City as the first female physician in this area. In 1889, she had her only child, Jackie, who unfortunately passed away in 1896 at the age of 6. So she's had her groundbreaking success and now the heartbreak. She had married another doctor, so she and her husband lived on State Street in a house that has now been renovated and redone and is in gorgeous shape. However, their marriage did not survive the death of their son, Jackie. Jackie died from diphtheria. And after his death, Dr. Rosenthal-Thompson, Augusta, decided to go to Europe because that was where the major research in pediatric medicine was being done. And she and her husband were heartbroken that especially as doctors, they hadn't been able to save their son's life. So Dr. Augusta went to Europe, had to fight quite hard to get the training she wanted because women, especially in Europe, still weren't being accepted very well as physicians. She was gone for 2 years. And when she came back to the United States, her husband sued for divorce based on desertion, and they were divorced. But this is where the providence or perhaps the karma of the story comes in. When Dr. Rosenthal-Thompson arrived back in Traverse City, there was a couple there to meet her at the station, friends of hers. Their young son was near death from diphtheria, the same disease that had killed Augusta's own son. Because of the training she had received in Europe during those 2 years, she was able to go to their son and save his life. After her return, eventually Dr. Augusta Rosenthal-Thompson moved to Grand Rapids, where she practiced for many more years, and she eventually died at the age of 95 in 1954. Her body was brought back up here to Traverse City, buried next to her son, Jackie, in an unmarked grave. In the late 1990s, early 2000s, the Traverse Area Genealogical Society member Ginny LeClaire and other members found out about Dr. Augusta Rosenthal-Thompson and that her grave was unmarked. They worked on this for several years, and eventually the Genealogical Society, the Historical Society, and the Zonta Club put together an effort to purchase a marker and to put a marker on this grave of this woman who had such a groundbreaking, if heartbreaking, life. Hi, my name is Peg Siciliano, and I'm with the Traverse Area Historical Society. We're at Oakwood Cemetery today looking at some of the monuments, and right now we're at the Ida Greilick Monument, one of the most beautiful monuments in the cemetery. Her story is quite tragic. She died when she was 19. She belongs to the Greilick family of Greilickville fame. She was born in 1869 and passed away in 1888. She was engaged to be married and went down to Detroit with family in order to buy clothing for her wedding and for her honeymoon afterwards. While she was down there, the carriage she was riding in hit the side of a curb or a stone in the road, and she was thrown. She hit her head on something and passed away 2 days later. You can see by the monument, her family obviously loved her much. It shows in what they decided to use to commemorate her, and probably that the family had quite a bit of money, and we'll talk about why we know that in a few minutes. One of the things you'll notice when you look at the top of the statue is she's holding roses in her hand, and she has a star on the top of her head. Both of those things indicate eternity, and the idea that the star, the idea that she is in the heavens looking down on her family. When you look at the monument and you get a better look at it, you'll notice that the words at this part here are carved into the stone, but down here the word Greilick is carved out of the stone. And whenever you're looking at a monument anywhere, it costs more to carve the letters out of the stone. That takes much more work than to carve them into the stone. So when you see a monument that has these letters carved out, that's one indication that either the family had quite a bit of money or they pooled what little money they had in order to be able to order a very significant item to commemorate their family member with. We're here to look at several different types of markers that you can see throughout the cemetery. And I think what they do is they point out that while sometimes people think of cemeteries as being spooky places, especially around certain times of the year like Halloween, or places of discomfort, they actually can be places where people can memorialize their loved ones, express their sorrow, feel closer to their family members. And the types of monuments they choose to place over their family members can tell us a lot about what happened in those lives. For example, here we have half a tree, and oftentimes this type of monument, it indicates a life cut short because the stump has been cut off. You can see the same thing over here in this one, where it is a stump, another life cut short, and there's a small lamb, and the lamb often signifies a child. So this is a child who has passed away long before one would think one's life should be ended. So as you walk through Oakwood or any other cemetery, take a look at the different kinds of monuments and see what you think they might be symbolizing. We talked about the logs and the trees cut halfway down, but look at, in a moment you'll see examples of huge stones, and those huge boulders even indicate solidarity, that the memories will go on, everlasting life that will go on forever. Another symbol of that everlasting life are the globes. You'll see a lot of monuments with round polished globes on top of them, and those also indicate eternity and the heavens. And eternity, again, is also indicated by the tall spires. I tend to think of them as looking a little bit like the Washington Monument, only obviously much smaller, and those also point to the heavens. Again, especially in the older parts of the cemetery, we can remember that certainly in the 1800s, well into the 1900s, pretty much the entire society had a full faith in a higher being and a life after. And our society may have changed a little bit now, although many people still have those beliefs, but certainly it was something that was believed throughout the community 100 years ago. So as you listen to these interesting historical stories and cultural facts that you can learn by going through a cemetery, we hope that you will consider going on our tours again next summer when they actually can come back in person and find out all sorts of wonderful stories about, why do they have ferns on this monument? Who was the Johnson family? I don't know if this one in particular will be included, but when you go through a cemetery, there are just stories all over the place, and we would be thrilled to be able to share them with you in the future.